Hello Year 11, hope you're all well. So what I'm going to do in this video is I'm just going to go over some of those key areas that we've looked at since lockdown so we can just retrieve that information. Now I'll start with the Hungarian uprising in 1956, which we actually covered just before we went into lockdown. So we know that Hungary comes under that kind of Soviet sphere of influence, and what happened is the people of Hungary want more freedoms. Remember, it'd been led by a guy, Rákosi, who's removed. He was a close ally with Stalin, and they appoint a new leader, Nagy, and they want basically more freedoms. We know that the communist countries are ruled with an iron fist, and the people don't have many freedoms, so they want more freedoms. And what they threaten to do is to leave the Warsaw Pact. Remember, the Warsaw Pact is obviously that group of communist countries. Now, Khrushchev, who had come in after Stalin, he sends in Soviet troops and they crush the rebellion. So they crush this uprising against communism. And Nagy is taken off and he's executed. And what it shows is that the USSR are not going to let these countries leave the Warsaw Pact. They're not going to not have complete control over these communist countries. Next up is the construction of the Berlin Wall in 1961. I know that many of you, when you went to Germany, have seen kind of the remnants of the Berlin Wall. So effectively what was happening was that Khrushchev is very concerned about people leaving the east side of Berlin to go to the west side of Berlin. So what we call this brain drain. So all these top people leaving because actually the west side of Berlin looks more attractive. They've got shops, they've got money, they've got capitalism, and it just seems like a more attractive option for the people in the east. So Khrushchev is desperate for people not to leave East Berlin. He claims it's because of kind of espionage and spying that's happening, that the West are sending in loads of spies, but really it's because he doesn't want all these people leaving East Berlin and showing communism up. So in 1961, they start the construction of the Berlin Wall, and people are no longer allowed to leave that side. Next, we're going to zoom over to Cuba, which is obviously just below America on the map, and the Bay of Pigs incident in 1961. Now, before 1959, Cuba had been an ally of the Americans, but there is a communist revolution and a guy called Fidel Castro comes into power. So Cuba has become this communist country. Remember, the Americans want to stop the spread of communism, so suddenly having a communist country right on its doorstep is quite worrying for them. So they want to overthrow communism. So what they do is they send in ex-Cubans. So 1,500 ex-Cubans that they train up, that they're going to send in. However, the message gets to the Cubans that this is going to happen. So when the ex-Cubans arrive at the Bay of Pigs, so it's this bay called the Bay of Pigs, they are confronted with basically the Cuban army, and it is a disaster because they're completely outmatched, completely outnumbered. And it's an embarrassment for Kennedy because he ended up having to buy back effectively the ex-Cubans for 50 million. So this is kind of Kennedy's first attempt to tackle communism, and it ends disastrously. Kennedy's does, however, learn some lessons. So the next big confrontation with the communists is the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. So Khrushchev is determined to keep Cuba a communist country, and as such he sends in nuclear weapons. Basically he ships in nuclear weapons to Cuba, and the U-2 spy plane, the American U-2 spy plane, finds these nuclear weapons. It discovered these nuclear weapons, and we know that obviously Cuba is right on the doorstep of America, so people, and Kennedy is very worried about this situation. So in terms of the events of the Cuban Missile Crisis, we know that what Kennedy does is he orders this naval blockade. So he puts the Navy around Cuba to stop any more Russian ships bringing in what they need to construct these nuclear sites on in Cuba. So this Cuban Missile Crisis lasts for 13 days. Remember, it's the closest the world has ever come to war, and it is resolved through diplomacy. So there is a series of faxes sent between Khrushchev and Kennedy. And what eventually happens is Khrushchev agrees to remove the missiles if Kennedy says that he's not going to invade Cuba. And what the Americans also agreed to, but secretly, is that in 6 months' time, they will get rid of their nuclear weapons in Turkey, which is obviously very close to Russia. So closest the world's ever got to war. Countries very, very scared that actually this nuclear war is going to happen. And it does make them both think about maybe following a kind of different strategy. So as a consequence of the Cuban Missile Crisis, what you get is you get this phone line, the hotline set up between Kennedy and Khrushchev so that there is no miscommunication. We know that they introduced in 1963 the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, so they're not going to test nuclear weapons above ground, so that to try and alleviate some of the kind of scaremongering. And both the sides, who are both at this point spending an awful lot of money on developing nuclear weapons, are going to look at trying potentially to find some more peaceful solutions. It kind of scared both sides. So what we've also looked at is the Prague Spring in 1968. Now the Prague Spring is similar-ish to the Hungarian uprising in that the USSR send in tanks, crush the rebellion, but these people weren't even looking to leave the Warsaw Pact. So Dubček had come into power in Czechoslovakia. He is a communist, but he wants to be communism with a face. He wants socialism with a face. He wants to give his people slightly more freedom. So they get rid of censorship, for example. So freedom of the press, which is usually not something you'd have in the USSR. They start having kind of more Western style. So people going out and enjoying meals and dancing and all those sorts of things. And Brezhnev, who is the leader at this point, sees this as a threat. So the USSR go in and crush this rebellion. And the USA at this point are involved in the Vietnam War, so they don't do anything about this. But again, it underlines that the USSR are going to not allow any communist countries from leaving their kind of Warsaw Pact and their sphere of influence. Now, the 1970s saw a kind of change in relationship between these two sides, and we call this period the period of détente, which means relaxing of tensions. So there was a few signifiers of that. The first being SALT, which was the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks in 1972, where basically going to limit the amount of nuclear weapons or ICBMs that they're making. In 1975, they signed the Helsinki Accords, which they promise they're going to allow their people more freedoms. So the USSR promise they're going to do that. Obviously, they don't do that, but they do promise they're going to do that. And we also have that meeting in space, which is very symbolic because it shows that the sides are willing to cooperate during this period of time. Now, they were going to sign SALT II agreement in 1979, but what happens is the Soviets invade Afghanistan like we looked at yesterday. So that changes and ends the period of détente.